Repeat the question.
I guess the simple version is there a limitation to this practice as it applies to self, and then extrapolating that to community?
I have a little variation on the question that might. We're remodeling our kitchen, we're using all sorts of tools. And we're finding that sometimes you have to have a specific tool for a specific job. And so it's nice to have a lot of tools to be able to get the job done. It'd be great to have a universal tool that did everything. And so the question, I guess the question might be, do we have a universal tool here that does everything for us?
Now it's 3 or 4 days.
Is that
No, I'm not looking for a universal tool. I'm more interested in the teachings as it applies to your practice, and that being a way of contemplating how you extrapolate that into working outside, in your neighborhood. If you're sitting in your home meditating, but you don't even know your neighbors, and every time you walk out, you see, trash on your neighbor's lawn, you're like, oh, that person's a horrible person, they don't care about our community, and yet, not knowing the person, perhaps they're disabled, perhaps they're lacking in funds, or perhaps they don't care. But if you care about the community, perhaps you can extend yourself instead of you judging, like, well, I'm perfect in my sitting, and I think of these perfect things, but applying them. And that's sometimes where I feel like there can be a disconnect, with the teachings.
Yeah, again, I think it's in a certain sense, it's the central question to our entire practice. And of course, the issue of the sense of self that we each have is also central to virtually every Buddhist tradition. What do you do with that? You might think that it would be good to put it aside, but who's putting it aside? And where are you putting it? It's one of those things that, in a certain way, plagues us as practitioners. And so we're often reminded and advised to treat it as a friend to start with, and gradually come to know it better. So the underlying assumption there is that actually we don't know ourselves very well. And we think we do because we have ideas about ourselves and titles, as you mentioned, that we give ourselves and that we give to others, and characteristics that we assign to ourselves and others that may or may not actually be they may not be relevant, they may not be accurate, they may not be a reflection of what others think of us, which then also brings us back to the kind of trouble we get in with others because of that sense of self. So is there a practice? Is there a limitation to the practice? In a big sense, I would say no, there's no limitation to it. In a practical sense, there's a lot of limitations to every practice that we engage in. And if we were to express a kind of ideal, we might say that of the literally hundreds of meditation practices that are represent kind of the core, thousands of them, if we expand it to what people are actually doing, there's a necessity to gradually familiarize ourselves with the very thing that we don't want to see, which is our self-centeredness. I think universally we have a sense of disdain for self-centeredness, if not in ourselves, at least in others, which we also recognize as a manifestation of the very thing that we disdain within ourselves. And so that kind of familiarization, which in the beginning can feel very kind of self-judging about ourselves, gradually needs to evolve to a place where, rather than being a judgment, it becomes a level of familiarization, deeper and deeper and deeper. So we could also say a level of deeper honesty, integrity, kind of a brutal honesty with ourselves, and a very soft lack of judgment with others. And the practice of calm abiding can contain all of those practices. In fact, we say any of the practices can contain and manifest as all of them. But for most of us, having maybe not spent enough time with any of the practices, it doesn't actually manifest like that. So it's helpful if your interest is in the direction that you're mentioning, then it's helpful to explore that by a number of avenues. Talking with somebody who's done more practice and maybe come to see the richness that isn't obvious there. Reading certain books on the subject, listening to certain teachings on the subject, that sort of thing, so that you get a sense that actually there's a lot more there than just settling the mind. There's also, when you settle the mind, you discover actually it isn't settled. It's actually tends to go the other way. It gets less settled. And so we have kind of self-centeredness about that too. For example, I want my mind settled. But the more you beat on it, the more it just refuses. And we get busier. And at a certain point, we have to come to some kind of resolution with that. And usually that doesn't happen in the very beginning by just our own work. We have to get help and talk with others and all. The limitation that calm abiding has is exactly as you say. It appears to be in the beginning very self-centered. On the other hand, you could say that's also its strength. Because in the very beginning, that's what we want. I want something that makes me feel good in the beginning. And I'm thinking to myself, maybe I'm a good person, and I hope that you feel good too, but actually, since I feel so bad, I'm trying to get that done, put aside first. And little by little, those pieces can kind of come together. And I think perhaps one of the most profound ways that we can benefit our neighbors is by kindness, careful and skillful relationships with others, always coming from a place of kindness and understanding that everybody is confused. Even when we think we're clear, what we're really clear about is confused. We just haven't discovered that yet. And the path is meant to take us out of that confusion into a place of genuine clarity, rather than just the sense of, I want people to think I'm clear. I want people to acknowledge that I'm wise, that I'm skillful, that I'm a good person. And they don't always abide by that wish. And so we can sometimes get it from our spiritual community when we hold a sense generally that we would all like to transform something so that we are better for ourselves and better for others. And the methods are there, the tools are there. But again, we want a universal tool. All of the tools are universal and all of them are specific. So gradually we can come to the place where we make the appropriate discoveries. One of the great important kind of attitudes that we need to adopt is that there's no timeline on this. Like, we didn't start today on it, we're not going to end today. And if we could develop a great deal of patience from just that perspective, where it's more helpful to discover the joy in the process than it is to work towards some conclusion which never arrives, because the conclusion itself is almost self-contradictory. Erik? No, you're supposed to wrap it up nicely, you know.
Well, I'll write it down. What you're pointing out is the essence of the whole Buddhist path, right? It's the bodhicitta, the vow to benefit others. And there's a whole, I mean, it, if you were to boil the whole path down into, kind of one thing, that's the thing, is bodhicitta. And so the question you're asking is, at a certain point, how does calm abiding accomplish that end? And I think you're right. If all calm abiding was the practice that you did while you were on the cushion, if that's as far as it went, then it wouldn't. And I have a quote from one of the 7 points of mind training books, and the 7 points of mind training really are the kind of central text from our tradition for carrying the practice into the world. And I don't think they include instructions on calm abiding.
No, they don't.
Do they?
Yeah, on the second point.
Oh,
The second, okay. There's 50, but there's like 53 points, and they cover it in point 2. So that's where it kind of fits in. But so this is from a kind of controversial teacher, but he writes beautifully, named Osho. And it's about the point, begin the development of taking, and he means taking on the world's problems with yourself. So he says, you cannot do anything with others that you have not done in the first place with yourself. You can hurt others if you've hurt yourself. You will be a pain in the neck to others if you're a pain in the neck to yourself. You can be a blessing to others only if you're a blessing to yourself. Rather than starting by taking the whole misery of the world and absorbing it into your heart, start with your own misery. Don't go into the deep sea so fast. Learn swimming in shallow water. You can say to yourself, yes, I am taking the misery of the whole world. Well, what do you know of the misery of the whole world? You have not even experienced your own misery. We go on avoiding our own misery. If you feel miserable, you put on the radio or the TV, or you become engaged. You start reading the newspaper so that you can forget your misery, or you go to the movies, or you to go to your woman or your man. Just somehow to keep yourself away from yourself so that you don't need to look at how much it hurts within. So first you have to begin with yourself. If you're feeling miserable, let it become a meditation. Sit silently. Close the doors. First, feel the misery with as much intensity as possible. Feel the hurt. Somebody has insulted you. Now, the best way to avoid the hurt is to go and insult him, so that you become occupied with him. This is not meditation. If someone has insulted you, feel thankful to him that he has given you the opportunity to feel a deep wound. Just close the room, sit silently, with no anger for the person, but with total awareness of the feeling that is arising in you. The hurt feeling that you've been rejected, that you've been insulted. Then you'll be surprised that not only is this man there, all the people who have ever insulted you will start moving in your memory. Stop all occupation, because that too is a subtle drug. Just be silent, utterly alone. Don't even pray, because that again is a drug. You're becoming occupied. You start talking to God, you start praying, you escape from yourself. Atisha is saying, just be yourself. Whatever the pain of it and whatever the suffering of it, just let it be so. So, I think that's an articulation of the power that calm abiding actually can have. Like, in order to sit with your own experience and your own suffering and to know that and to come to terms with that, calm abiding is very helpful. And the thought is that way of being, you're training yourself in a way of being that then impacts the way that you can interact with every other being. And then, if that's what you bring into your encounters with others, something different can come next, more than just the same old reactive pattern stuff.
Thank you.
So, this might be the same question, or maybe this is, I've noticed that,
Would you speak up a little bit?
I've noticed that lately, the more I do small amounts of meditation, kind of sporadically, but fairly regularly, the more frustrated with, or sort of like suspicious of, no, I don't exactly know, resistant to the idea of not thinking. I am, because I feel like that, and maybe I'm misguided, but it feels like that's the goal. Like that's where I should be. I should just have like a empty mind.
Yeah.
And the counting feels like that's like standing next to that goal, because then I'm just empty of, like, I'm only doing this like boring thing, which is breathing and counting, and like it's not interesting. And so that's good because I can make my brain like just do this one thing, and my brain hates it.
You what? What was the last thing you said?
My brain hates it. It just hates it. And I wonder, and it has a lot of good reasons that it gives me for why it's, like maybe not useful, or, so I wonder if, so here's what I decided to hear you say just now. Like, does that mean that maybe I should just be like patient and kind to that part of my brain and not try to not think, like not try to not have a self? Should I just be like, oh, okay, this is myself and it's thinking all these things and I'm gonna just let it think all these things, because is that what I should do? Or no, or is that is that being like, I really like eating candy and I think I should just be gentle with myself and have this chocolate cake because it's good, it's delicious, and I'm only human after all.
Have you not tried that?
Eating a chocolate cake? Yeah, I've tried eating chocolate.
That's how'd that work?
Right, it's not as good as you think it's gonna be once it's done.
Yeah. There's no teaching that I have ever heard, though there's plenty I've made up for myself, But there's no teaching I've ever heard that said you should stop thinking.
Really?
That's pretty much the role of corpses. So, and I'm not even so sure about them. The issue here appears to be difficult because we have a kind of a lack of willingness to take the thing step by step. After all, if we say we need to familiarize ourselves with our own minds, the great majority of people will say, I already did that. I know that. When actually they haven't even looked yet. Haven't opened the hood and looked in to see, what's in there. And then the exploration, having looked in to see, the exploration becomes actually rather tricky. But it's stage by stage. First you have to have a willingness to look. So the counting the breaths is not the method by which we stop thinking, if that was the goal, which actually it isn't, but let's say it was. It still is not the method by which we do it. It's the method by which we start to prepare to do it. We have to first get clear about a few things. So to repeat something that I've said here before, but I think is so apropos, there was a day when I was talking to a teacher in Seattle, and we were talking about how you teach the Four Noble Truths, in particular the truth of suffering. It's actually difficult to get a real sense of what the truth of suffering is. So everyone will say, I suffer from time to time, but what the truth of suffering is what is that thing, is not so easy to get at. And so this teacher that I was talking to, while we were going back and forth and kind of sharing how we might do these things, he said, well, what I do is, when somebody comes to see me and they really don't know anything about Buddhism, which means they're right on the edge of actually having a grand experience because they don't yet know anything. Those of us who know things have the most difficulty. So often we have a thing we call beginner's luck, which you only really get once. And that is that you sit down and you don't know anything, and therefore you're open to everything, and you suddenly have marvelous experiences, which then you don't have for another 20 years. So you could say, there's the truth of suffering. But what he said was, I give the instruction, sit down, do not think, do not ponder, do not do anything, breathe, stay alive, and just be quiet and still. I have some things I have to do. I'll be back in a few minutes. So then he goes for 10 minutes, he comes back and he says, they know the truth of suffering. Because they can't shut the mind off, they can't relax, they can't just be still, either with their bodies or their minds. And therein lies the fundamental truth, which is, we are not who we think we are. And so the first thing that we have to do is, we have to make some discoveries about what the disease is. Speaking metaphorically, what is the disease? In order to familiarize ourselves with that disease, we have to do some things. So one thing is, and I share your abhorrence to counting breath. Nobody could share that more than I do. But when you count the breath and you find yourself saying to yourself, what the hell does this have to do with anything? Or any of a myriad of other objections, you've basically opened the hood and you're looking at it and smoke is pouring out. And if you hadn't opened the hood to look at it, it probably would have caught on fire. So the moment that we find ourselves saying, I hate this, is exactly where we need to be. Because what we are is, we're actually now looking at the disease. What is it? Why do I hate this? Big deal. 5 minutes it takes to do 21 breaths, you know, it's like not a big deal. So why is it worthy of such abhorrence when we're about to come to another stage, and maybe mostly we might say to ourselves, well, you know, on the road trip, the last town we stopped in was really bad, but you know, there's another one up front, and maybe there'll be a nicer place. Why is it that we don't say that with our mental phenomena? The lack of patience with ourselves is a source of suffering. The fear of not being free of that exact abhorrence is a cause of suffering. And when we look at very few of the dots that all connect to each other, we can see, well, this is a real mess. And that's exactly where we need to be. That's kind of the starting point. You can't begin to tease those things apart and look at them and explore them in a healthy way until you've seen them. As long as you avoid them, you don't see them. But they don't stop affecting us.
Question? Oh, was that? Sorry.
I just want to see if Laura has a follow-up question.
Follow-up abhorrence.
I was just trying to think about how it would work. Like, if you're counting your breaths and you're just, or when I'm counting my breath and like, I don't know how it would work. Like, how do I see what the smoke is? Like, I just stand there and smoke, like coughing. Like, I don't exactly know what. Maybe I just stand there and smoke, coughing indefinitely, and then the answer appears. Like, suddenly I'm a mechanic.
Smell
Like,
coffee.
just like that.
Smell smoke. Smell coffee.
Smoke.
Well, there's. Let's put a couple of principles on the table around the entire path. One is that experience itself is preeminent. And yet there are many people who are Buddhists who actually never practice. They engage in all of the conceptual activities around it because there's a deep philosophical tradition associated with it too. And I say too because it doesn't necessarily have hardly any relationship to the actual experience of things. The experience of things is the real nub. It's the place where the real work happens. And when you say, I'm having this like reaction to doing this, that's exactly the experience. The experience is there, so now you have something to work with. If we just talk about it, it's like we have something to work with that has only the satisfaction of, oh, I see how that works. But actually, when you see your next door neighbor who you don't like, you still feel like yelling at them. And actually, that's sort of, it's the grade you get. You know, how did I do? Well, not so good yet. The philosophical stuff is really weak in terms of personal transformation. The direct experience with our own mental stuff is really where the heat is that we want to avoid, but at the same time we can see the heat, we can see the want to avoid, we can see the fear that we won't be able to avoid it, and the hope that we will someday be able to avoid it, all those things, and we can understand that we haven't yet figured this out. If it were easy to figure out, we might honestly say everyone would be enlightened. We could just come here and kind of get some small instruction and do it. There's a reason why people spend their entire life working on this, because it's actually really difficult. It's wound up in all of our habitual patterns, which manifest without our invitation. I don't want to be angry, but I am. And the more I say, I don't want to be angry, the more angry I am. And, you know, working through those things is the actual work of the path. And calm abiding is generally in the West where we start. But it might be worth just noting that in the East, in Tibet, calm abiding is considered a very advanced practice. And it's partly because of just what you've raised. It's just really difficult. So in the beginning in Tibet, where they start with rituals. Rituals that for us, we would say, this ritual has absolutely no meaning. At least when you count 21 breaths, you can understand, I'm trying to remain still for 21 breaths, right? Maybe you're not, no one ever said you should remain still. They just said count 21 breaths, you know. But we add that in. At least at that point we have a sense of, I kind of get what it's for. But if I say to you, recite a mantra, for example, that has no meaning, you may actually have the sense of, this is some kind of thing that comes from some other culture, I don't relate to it. And even in Tibet, they maybe felt like many of the rituals really didn't make sense. But that's where they start, is with a lot of rituals that has cultural backing. We don't have that cultural backing, so to start there tends to be off-putting. We tend to want to start with the actual work. And the actual work is first, notice that your mind is crazy. I mean, really. What else can you call it when you sit down and you would like to just rest your awareness without being bothered by all sorts of things, and actually you neither rest your awareness nor are you free of all the things that bother us, so we just stir around in there. That is not pleasant. And when we can't stop it, I don't know what else we would call that, but a certain kind of temporary insanity. Hopefully temporary. And that's where the actual work is. So part of the training can be, and I'm thinking of this guy who's sitting there, has been told to sit and don't do anything for 10 minutes, which is like an impossibility, like jump up in the air and don't come down for 10 minutes. You know, it's kind of like at that level of possibility. I'm thinking of him sitting there and just doing what we always do. I'll be gone. I'll be back in 10 minutes. So what do? You don't. Who says, well, now I'll just not think for 10 minutes? Nobody does that. They think like crazy. Well, I wonder if I'll like this person. Maybe I won't. I wonder if I should get up and leave. What's happening? Do they have any magazines to read? Well, I don't like that magazine. Maybe I'll read this one. No, I don't like that one. Well, what am I going to do for lunch? I don't know. Maybe I'll go there. We don't even notice that we're doing that, and that we're actually not behind the wheel. Something else is. And when we notice that, it should be something that is shocking. Who's driving this thing? When do I have a say about where we go? And when you answer that question, you've asked a really difficult question, because you won't find an answer to it. And that should be very troubling. Why am I not deciding what I'm thinking about? Who's deciding? Why do I just go all over the place? And if I count 21 breaths, I can't even stop then. I'm objecting to the counting the breaths. Probably we're not objecting to breathing 21 times, but we're objecting to the counting of it. We can't see how it's going to bear fruit or what the fruit would be. And the fruit actually is you're coming face to face with the very thing that we need to deal with. And I think it's totally fair to say, I hate that practice. I hated that practice for a long time. I still don't do it very much, but some people love that practice. And one of the keys, I think, is, as anyone who has practiced for, let's say, a decade or more will say, when you encounter the very thing that you don't want to encounter, you have landed at the place you need to be. Not because you deserve to suffer forever, but because that suffering is now recognized as suffering.
I think to go back to where you were sort of starting originally. This isn't a practice of forcing yourself to do something. Like, I don't think there's, and so if it feels like that, or if that's what you're practicing, then your mind is right to object to that. Like, we don't like to be forced to do anything. So, least of all by ourselves, consciously, like it's, just think about any other time in your life when someone tried to force you to do something, and what was the output of that. So the practice is not one of forcing yourself. And if you think the goal is to have no thoughts, then you have no alternative but to try to force yourself to have no thoughts, and then you would just be frustrated and kind of miserable. So that isn't the practice. But it is one of the fruits of the practice, as Lama Michael points out. Like, this is kind of how you learn how to do it and how to not do it, is this way. So it is a practice of kindness and gentleness, and the act of bringing yourself back to your breath. So when you notice, when you're feeling upset or miserable or wow, this sucks, the practice is, when you notice that, is you kind of let go of that line of thought or thinking, and very simply bring yourself back to the breathing. And it may be that your mind is like, no, that's what I didn't want to do in the first place. But that again is more distraction. And when you notice that that's the line of thinking, then you very peacefully bring yourself back. And you could use the analogy of pain when sitting. Like, sometimes you're sitting and pain arises. And if you think that you have to sit there and not move and just keep going regardless what, you're not supposed to move, and you force yourself to stay in that position, the pain's going to get worse. And the instruction is not never move. Like, the instruction is not force yourself to stay there. But as Lama Michael points out, there is something to be learned from the experience of pain. And you probably don't want to never have that experience your whole life. So sometimes, I think it is, when you feel up to it, it is good to try to go as deeply into those experiences as you feel that you safely can do. And over time, I think your capacity increases. And one of the sneaky things about your brain is, if it complains loud enough, you'll stop and let it do something else. Then it's like a 2-year-old, right? It's like, oh, it learns. Okay, if I just throw a big enough tantrum, I'm going to get what I want. So you kind of want to take that into account when you give it, what it wants. That you may actually be planting the seeds for more chaos, to self-inflicted chaos to come. But your instinct is right. It is essentially a practice of kindness and gentleness.
I had a question that's similar, or on the line of what you just asked.
Can you speak up a little?
Yeah, I have a question that's similar to what she was just mentioning, but
Just speak up.
yeah. So my question is, how do we know that that's even possible to look directly at your mind? How do we know that that's possible? If somebody else is driving this train, how do we know that it's even possible for us to be able to drive it or to look directly at what's happening? Like the eye can't look at itself, so how do we know the mind can look at itself?
Well, you don't. You don't know that, but the approach that you're taking in this moment is completely conceptual.
Mm-hmm.
So from that perspective, if we just step back from that a little bit, we could ask the question from another side. If you're sick and feeling a lot of pain, how do you know you're feeling that pain?
Mm-hmm.
So intentionally framing it in a way which is somewhat absurd.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, isn't it just the same thing?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can only look at the experience of the pain. If the pain has some other meaning of some kind or some other basis, maybe you can't look at that. You may not be able to look at the neurological basis of the pain, right? On the other hand, looking at the neurological basis of the pain, you may not be able to look at the pain itself. When you actually have an experience, you can notice that experience, which is the looking at it. So we often say that actually you cannot look at the mind. There's nothing there to see. Nothing there to see in the ordinary way that we see things. But this is also any discipline that you might adopt, a worldly discipline, a spiritual discipline, is likely designed, and this is certainly the case here, to lead you into places that you have not explored before. So I think all of the questions, all of the doubts, all of the preformed ideas, all of those things are worthy of looking at and exploring. One of my favorite teachings is that one of the biggest obstacles to this path is belief itself. So I think that's an interesting proposition. Some of us may not find that easy to embrace, but whenever we believe something, it's like we have the sense that we have some kind of understanding and knowledge of something. And when we have that knowledge, it's difficult then to replace that with something else, which might be the actual thing we were looking for, which is why belief then can become an obstacle. Better a kind of confidence through the exploration that gradually matures. We become more clear about things without hanging on to them, having seen that some of our presuppositions gradually dissolved and melted by virtue of our continuous looking into things. We hang on with less tenacity to what we think might be right or wrong, and thereby keep ourselves open to something new that we might otherwise ourselves stand in the way of.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Is it okay if I just share my personal experience that, and I think a teacher or two has commented on this, that when I go out into the world and I'm trying to do good, if I don't have calm abiding, even though I may not do it very well in my view, that particular session, that session may feel terrible. Even when I do a terrible session, you know, where I think I'm distracted and all, I do notice that my mind, that I'm much more accepting after that session toward myself and others. And I think that that does get reflected in the way I behave toward other people. So because I'm having to accept my mind going all over the place and trying to discipline myself, it makes me more understanding that everybody else is struggling with the same thing, and makes me a little bit more compassionate and gentle, I think. I'd like to do that. So, and, yeah.
Thank you. Any more, Erik?
I was listening to you. I was hearing the echoes of the aspirations for Mahamudra, and so I thought what you gave was a very nice sort of more lay language articulation of that. But it's worth hearing, like how the third Karmapa, for example, describes all of this stuff. So he says, confidence in outlook is cutting assumptions, and those could be beliefs, about the ground. The key to meditation is maintaining that without distraction. The supreme activity is to exercise the sense of meditation in everything. May I have confidence in outlook, meditation, and activity. All dharmas are projections of the mind. As for mind, there is no mind. Mind's nature is empty. Empty and immediate, mind appears as everything. Investigating it well, may I settle the basic points. Appearances, which never existed in themselves, have been confused as objects. Awareness itself, because of ignorance, has been confused as a self. Through the power of dualistic fixation, I wander in the realm of existence. May ignorance and confusion be completely resolved. It doesn't exist. Even Buddhists do not see it. Doesn't not exist. It is the origin of samsara and nirvana. No contradiction, conjunction, the middle way. May I realize the pure being of mind, free of extremes. If one says, it is this, nothing has been posited. If one says, it is not this, nothing has been denied. Unconditioned, pure being transcends intellect. May I gain conviction in the ultimate position. It goes on like that. You could tell this was a point of interest for many, many centuries.
You will dedicate the merit from the session.
By this virtue,
I quickly realize Mahamudra and establish all beings without exception in this state. Thank you all.
And of course, the real world goal.
opportunity we have for service is to start by taking out the pillows out on the porch and hitting them, get the dust out, and then bring them back in.